the year of our Lord 897, a dead man stood trial for his crimes. Not in metaphor, not in legend. The corpse of Pope Formosus was physically dragged from its tomb, dressed in papal robes and placed upon a throne to answer for his sins. I was there. I was the deacon assigned to speak for the dead. Rome in January. The cold seeped through the stone walls of the Lateran Basilica like water through a cracked vessel. 9 months earlier, Pope Formosus had died. Some said naturally, others whispered of poison. But in Rome, the dead rarely rest, especially not dead popes. His successor, Stephen VI, had waited 9 months in the ground. 9 months of decomposition, and then he gave the order, dig him up. I remember the smell before I saw the body. It entered the basilica like a physical presence. Sweet and rotten, the unmistakable perfume of the grave. The monks who carried the casket gagged. 2 of them vomited into their habits. They dressed him in full papal vestments, the white alpi, the red chasuble, the pallium around what remained of his neck. His skin had blackened and pulled away from the bone. His eyes were gone, empty sockets, staring at nothing, but they placed a papal tiara on his head anyway. It kept sliding. A monk had to hold it in place. Stephen VI sat across from the corpse, elevated on his own throne. His face was unreadable, but I saw his hands. They were trembling. The charges were read. Formosus had held 2 bishoprics simultaneously. He had sought the papal throne through ambition, not divine will. He had crowned an illegitimate emperor, and I, a deacon of 23 years, barely old enough to shave, was ordered to stand beside the rotting thing and answer for him. Every time Stephen asked a question, I had to reply as Formosus. Stephen, did you accept the papacy through ambition rather than divine calling? Me, speaking for the dead, I did. Stephen, did you violate the sacred canons of the church? Me again, I did. That is when I noticed something. The corpse had not moved. Of course it hadn't. But the air around it had changed. The candles on the altar, all 12 of them, flickered at the same moment. Not 1, not 2, all 12. In a room with no wind. No one else seemed to notice. Or perhaps they chose not to. The trial lasted hours. Stephen screamed questions. I answered. The corpse sat in silence, and yet, I swear before God, it felt less like I was speaking for Formosus, and more like Formosus was speaking through me. The verdict, guilty on all counts. Then came the desecration. They stripped the papal vestments from the body. The pallium was torn from his neck, taking skin with it. The 3 fingers of his right hand, the fingers used to confer blessings, were cut off with a butcher's blade. The sound was wet and wrong. They dragged him through the streets of Rome. Children threw stones at the corpse, women spat, and then they threw him into the Tiber River. That should have been the end, but the Tiber does not keep its dead. Days later, a fisherman found the body caught in his nets downriver. He pulled it ashore and, terrified, ran to the nearest church. But by the time the clergy arrived, a crowd had gathered, and they were not horrified. They were kneeling. A woman claimed her blind son could suddenly see. A man with a withered arm said he had touched the corpse and been healed. Word spread. Within days, the dead pope was being called a martyr, a saint. His mutilated body was carried in procession back to St. Peter's, and then the statues began to weep. At least, that is what the people said. Statues of the Virgin Mary shedding tears of blood. Icons of saints turning their faces away. The bells of St. Peter's rang by themselves in the dead of night. Rome held its breath, and then the earth moved. An earthquake struck the city. The Lateran Basilica, the very hall where the trial had taken place, collapsed from its roof to its altar. The beam that fell crushed the exact spot where Stephen VI had sat in judgment. Stephen was not killed in the collapse, but the message was clear to everyone who had witnessed the trial. The dead pope had answered. Months later, Stephen VI was deposed by an angry mob. They stripped him of his papal vestments, just as he had stripped Formosus. They dragged him through the streets, just as Formosus had been dragged, and they threw him into a prison cell, where he was strangled by unknown hands. His body was left unburied for days. Dogs fed on it. No fisherman pulled him from the water. No miracles were reported. I left Rome that year. I could no longer look at the Tiber without seeing the blackened face of a dead man staring back at me. I became a wandering monk, one of thousands in those dark centuries, moving from monastery to monastery, never staying long. But the dreams followed me every night. I dream of that throne and the thing that still sits upon it, waiting for a new deacon to speak on its behalf. The Cadaver Synod is not legend. The 8th of January 97 AD, one of the most bizarre and macabre events in the history of the Catholic Church, documented by multiple contemporary sources. The body of Pope Formosus did wash ashore. Miracles were reported. The basilica did collapse, and Stephen VI was indeed strangled in his cell. They say the dead cannot speak, but sometimes they need to. They called me il medico della peste, the plague doctor. You have seen my face 100 times without ever truly seeing it. The beaked mask, the glass eyes, the wide-brimmed hat. I am the silhouette that haunts your imagination of the Black Death, but you do not know what the mask was really for. It was October 1347. 12 Genoese galleys had docked at the port of Messina, in Sicily. The sailors aboard were dying. Black boils the size of eggs swelled in their armpits and groins. They vomited blood onto the docks. Within days, the city was silent. By the time it reached my town, a small commune outside of Florence, we had all heard the stories. Ships arriving with crews of corpses, entire villages disappearing overnight, mass graves so deep that the layers of bodies outnumbered the layers of earth. I was a physician, not a university-trained doctor. Those men had fled to the countryside the moment the first bubo appeared. I was a barber surgeon. I bled people. I pulled teeth. I had no business facing down the greatest pestilence in human history. But I had no family to flee with, no coin to bribe a car driver. So I stayed, and I built my mask. The design came from a French physician, Charles Delaunay, though I did not know his name then. The beak was stuffed with dried herbs, lavender, mint, rose petals, camphor, cloves. The theory was that the plague traveled through my asthma, bad air, and the herbs would purify what I breathed. The glass eyes protected me from the gaze of the dying. The leather coat, coated in wax, kept the contagion from touching my skin. The wooden cane I carried served two purposes: to lift the garments of the sick without touching them, and to keep the desperate at a distance. The first week, I treated 30 patients. 29 died. The second week, the cart came. You've heard the cry, I'm sure. It has become almost theatrical with time, a cliché of the period. But I promise you, there was nothing theatrical about the man who pulled that cart. He was a gravedigger named Matteo, and he had lost his wife and 3 children in the first outbreak. He did not shout, "Bring out your dead." He did not have the strength. He simply walked the streets with his cart, ringing a small bell, and the living dragged their dead to him in silence. By the end of the second month, I had treated over 200 people. Death count, 200. And yet, I did not fall ill. Not a cough, not a fever, not a single bubo. I walked through houses thick with death. I touched the weeping sores of the dying. I closed the eyes of children whose parents had already been carted away, and I remained untouched. At first, the townspeople saw it as a miracle. God had chosen me. I was their protector, their saint. But miracles in times of plague do not remain miracles for long. It was a woman named Elisabetta who said it first. She had lost her husband, her brother, and both her sons to the sickness. She stood in the town square, what remained of it, and pointed a trembling finger at my mask. Why does he not die? I tried to explain. The mask, the herbs, the waxed coat, science, not sorcery. But science meant nothing to people who had watched their children rot from the inside out, while a masked figure walked among them unscathed. Within a week, the name had changed. I was no longer il medico della peste. I was il antore, the anointer, the spreader, the one who carried the plague from house to house, not to cure, but to curse. That was when the flagellants arrived. You must understand, the flagellants were not priests. They were not sanctioned by the church. They were ordinary men, farmers, bakers, merchants, who had lost everything. They walked from town to town in procession, bare, chested even in winter, whipping themselves with leather straps tipped with iron hooks. Their backs were ribbons of scar tissue and fresh blood. They chanted hymns as they bled. They believed that if they suffered enough, God would lift his hand from humanity. But the flagellants brought something else with them. A hunger for blame. They entered our town on a Sunday. 37 men, led by a lay preacher named Enrico, whose eyes burned with a kind of certainty that only the truly broken possess. He stood on the steps of the church. The priest had died the week before, and he preached a sermon I will never forget. He said, the plague was not a disease. It was a judgment. It was not carried by rats or fleas or bad air. It was carried by sinners, by those who had made pacts with the devil, by those who walked among the dying and never died. Every head in the square turned toward my house. That night, I sat alone in my chamber. The mask hung on the wall, its glass eyes catching the candlelight. It looked almost alive in the flickering shadows. A second face, waiting. I thought about fleeing. But where? Every road led to another dying town. Every port had closed its harbor. The plague had made the entire world a prison. So I did the only thing that made sense. I put the mask back on. The knock came at midnight. Not the soft knock of a patient seeking help. The hammering of fists. The splintering of wood. I heard Elisabetta's voice among them, shrill and broken. Bring him out. Bring out the antore. They broke down the door. Enrico was at the front, his whip still wet with his own blood. Behind him, 36 flagellants. Behind them, most of the town. I stood in the center of the room, fully dressed in my play costume, mask, coat, cane. I must have looked like a devil to them, a creature from a fresco of hell. Enrico stepped forward. He raised his whip, and then he stopped. His face changed. The burning certainty drained from his eyes, replaced by something I had not seen in months. Fear. He was looking at my chest. I looked down. Nothing. Your breath, he whispered. I see no breath. It was a cold night. Breath should have misted in the air, but the leather of my mask showed nothing. No condensation, no sign of life beneath the beak. I raised my hand to remove the mask, to prove to them that I was just a man, just a frightened barber, surgeon who had stayed when everyone else fled. But my hands would not move, or rather, I could not feel them. I looked at my gloved hands and realized I could not remember the last time I had removed them. I could not remember the last time I had eaten, or slept, or felt the sun on my face. I searched my memory and found nothing, just the mask, just the rounds, just the dying, an endless corridor of faces contorted in their final moments, and at the end of it, me, standing, watching, never falling. I think I died in the first week. The realization came not as horror, but as a terrible kind of peace. The flagellants ran. The crowd scattered into the night. Elisabetta screamed something I could not understand, and I stood alone in my broken doorway. the mask still on my face, the cane still in my hand, and I understood why I had never fallen ill. You cannot kill what is already dead. The town emptied within a week. Those who could flee, fled. Those who could not, died. The flagellants moved on to the next village and the next, sowing panic wherever they went until the Pope himself condemned them as heretics. But I remained. I still make my rounds, not in that town. It no longer exists. But other towns, other plagues, other centuries. The mask never comes off. It can tea. I think it has become my face. The Black Death killed between 25 and 50 million people in Europe alone. Plague doctors, with their beaked masks and waxed coats, were real historical figures who risked, and often lost, their lives treating the sick. The flagellants were also real, a mass movement of penitents who marched through Europe, whipping themselves, eventually condemned by Pope Clement V in 1349. But here is a question history cannot answer. When you see a figure in a beaked mask walking through the empty streets of a dying city, who is really behind the glass eyes? The first thing I remember is the dirt, not the smell of it, the taste. I walk with my mouth full of earth, my tongue pressed against rough wood for a moment, a long floating moment that might have been seconds or hours. I did not understand where I was. I only knew that it was dark and cold, and that I could not move my arms. And then I heard the weight above me, the shifting of soil, the setting of earth that had been packed down by shovels, and I understood I had been buried alive. My name was Margherita. I was a midwife in Avignon. When the plague came, I had been sick for 3 days. Fever, the swelling, the black spots on my thighs that meant the end. I remember a priest saying words over me. I remember my sister weeping. And then I remember nothing. Until the dirt, they had buried me in the plague pit outside the city walls. A trench 100 feet long, layered with bodies and quicklime. They buried so fast in those months, sometimes before the heart had fully stopped. The gravediggers were overwhelmed, exhausted, terrified. They made mistakes. I was one of those mistakes. The coffin was not a coffin. It was a pine box, hastily nailed. The wood was thin. I could feel it bowing inward under the weight of the soil. I pressed my palms against the lid and pushed. It did not open. I pushed harder. The nails held. The dirt was too heavy. I screamed until my throat bled. No one came. I do not know how long I lay there. Long enough for the panic to burn itself out. Long enough for something colder to take its place. A slow, creeping certainty that this was where I would die. Not from the plague, but from the earth itself, pressing down until the box collapsed and filled my lungs with soil. And then I heard the music. It was faint at first, a flute perhaps, a high, reedy melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It was not beautiful. It was thin and strange, like wind passing through hollow bones. And beneath the music, a rhythm, not drums, something softer, a shuffling, a dragging, the sound of many feet moving in unison across dead ground. Not by my hands, not by any human hands. The nails slid free of the wood, as if the earth itself were rejecting them. The soil parted above me. Moonlight, pale and silver, fell upon my face for the first time in I did not know how long. I crawled out of the grave on hands and knees, gasping, retching dirt. The plague pit stretched around me, a raw wound in the earth, marked by wooden crosses leaning at drunken angle. The moon was full, the air was still, and I was not alone. They came from the darkness at the edge of the pit. At first I thought they were people, survivors, perhaps come to search for loved ones among the dead. But their movements were wrong, too slow. too synchronized. They did not walk, they swayed, and they were dancing. I had seen the painting, the dance macabre, the dance of death was the obsession of our age. Frescoes on church walls, woodcuts passed from hand to hand, skeletons leading the living in a grim procession, the Pope, the Emperor, the peasant, the child, all dancing toward the grave. But the paintings did not move, these did. There were dozens of them, perhaps more, figures in various states of decay. Some wore the fine silks of nobility, stained with grave seepage. Others were wrapped in the simple linen shifts of the poor. A few were naked, their skin pulled tight over bone, their eye sockets hollow and dark, and they were dancing. A slow, formal dance, almost a pavane, the courtly dance of the nobility, but twisted into something ancient and wrong. Their bare feet left no prints in the mud. The pipe music swelled and fell like breathing. At the head of the procession was a figure taller than the rest. It wore the remnants of a bishop's mitre, mouldering on a skull that showed too many teeth. In its skeletal hand it held a staff, but the staff was a human femur, polished white. It turned its head toward me. The music did not stop, but something in the melody shifted, became aware of me. The dancers paused. Every hollow face in that procession turned to look at the woman who had crawled out of her grave. The bishop figure extended its free hand. The gesture was almost kindly. An invitation. I understood in that moment that I had a choice. I could run. I could flee back toward the city gates, toward the world of the living. I could find my sister. I could try to reclaim my life. But what life? The town was dying. Half the houses were marked with the red cross of the plague. My sister had buried me. My body had been counted among the dead. I had no place left among the living. The dead, however, the dead were welcoming. I took the bishop's hand. Its fingers were cold and dry, like twigs wrapped in paper. The moment our hands touched, the music changed again, became sweeter, more insistent. I felt my feet begin to move before I told them to. I joined the dance. The procession moved through the outskirts of Avignon, along paths I had walked 1,000 times in life, but the world looked different now. The colors were muted, the sounds were distant. It was as if a thin veil had been drawn between me and the world of the living. We passed a farmhouse. A woman stood in the doorway, clutching a crying child. She did not see us. Or perhaps she did. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of instinctive terror before she slammed the door and bolted it from within. The living always know when death is near. They may not see it, but they feel it, in the sudden chill of a room, in the unexplained restlessness of animals, in the prickle at the back of the neck. We danced until dawn, through fields, through vineyards, through the narrow streets of the city itself, where the living pressed themselves against walls to let us pass, never knowing what they were making way for. As the first light touched the horizon, the bishop raised his staff. The music faded. The dancers stopped. One by one, they turned and walked into the earth, not into the ground itself, as if the soil had become water. They sank without sound, without disturbance, until only the bishop and I remained. He looked at me, this towering thing of bone and rotting vestments, and he spoke. His voice was not a voice. It was the sound of earth falling on a coffin lid. Not yet, child. You are not dead. You are between. And then he was gone, and I was alone in the grey light of dawn, standing at the gates of Avignon, wearing the burial shift my sister had dressed me in. I did not return to my sister's house. I did not try to reclaim my life. I understood now. I had been given something, not a second chance, but a purpose. I was a midwife still, but now I midwifed souls, not bodies. Those who stood at the threshold between life and death. I helped them cross. You will find me at every deathbed. You will catch a glimpse of me in the corner of the eye, in every plague hospital, every battlefield, every room where someone draws their last breath. I am the woman in the burial shift, the one who does not speak, the one who waits. And when the pipe music starts again, and it always starts again, I will be there, ready to dance. Premature burial was a genuine terror of the medieval period, especially during epidemics. The fear was so widespread that some coffins were fitted with bells and breathing tubes. The origin of the phrase, saved by the bell, and the tradition of graveyard shifts, where a night watchman would listen for bells ringing from fresh graves. The dance macabre, the dance of death, was not just art, it was a philosophy, a reminder that death comes for all of us. The rich, the poor, the holy, the sinner, and when it comes for you, listen for the music and do not be afraid to dance.